Should you buy an apartment now in New York City or should you wait? Well, if you're asking that question, you're certainly not alone. The market in New York City can be very confusing and is very unique and complex. But if you watch this entire video, I promise you'll come away with some information that will help inform that decision. And if you stick until the end of the video, we're going to talk about what's going on with the rental market in New York City, which most definitely, if you already live here, will inform whether or not now is the right time to buy. I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so that you can stay up to date on all things New York City real estate. And let's get started. Now, if you're thinking about buying in New York City, the first thing that you need to understand is that you're entering into one of the most complex and unique markets in the US. So you need to have as much information as you can as you enter that market. And in fact, if you're deciding to even enter that market, because that's your first big initial decision. So there are a few things to understand. We're going to look at what the seasons mean in New York City, some of the key data points that you need to understand, and then we're going to talk about if you're ready to buy or not. And finally, we're going to talk about the rental market, which has changed immensely almost overnight in New York City, and how that may be affecting your decision to buy. In New York City, we have primarily two main sales seasons, and that is the spring market and that is the fall market. Now, that differs from some other markets in the US where people are out in the summer and looking for things to buy in the summer. In New York City, summer is the big rental market, and also just a lot of people leave the city and go on vacations and get out of the city for weekends. So it's not a prime buying time. Now, what does that mean for you? If you can find something during one of those off seasons, perhaps during the summer or maybe the winter months, then you may be able to get a bargain as a buyer, because the sellers that are left out there are the ones that really need to sell. They're not going to pull it off the market. They're not going to wait and list it at another time during the prime sale season. They really need to sell, so they may be willing to negotiate a bit more than in other seasons. But that depends on whether or not you can actually find something that you like, because the inventory, of course, will be less during those months, and maybe apartments that are a little bit more difficult to sell. That does not mean that the apartments are bad, and that certainly does not mean that you might not think that it is the perfect apartment for you. It just means they may have been on the market for a little while longer for whatever reason. But that could hold an opportunity for you. So if you're looking to buy, you want to factor in those seasons, and you want to see maybe can you get started in the summer and maybe look at the inventory that's out there and see if you can get a bit of a bargain there. Now, you cannot determine if now is the right time to buy without some data. And we release market reports on this channel, so I highly recommend that you check those out. But let's look at some of the overview of what's going on in the market right now so that you can have some key stats behind you and understand if now would be a great time for you to buy. Now, if we were to look month to month, it's natural for all the numbers to go down right now because we're entering a slower season, and then those numbers will go back up come fall. But there are some key statistics to look at year over year that are very important and gives us some information as to what the market may do in the near future. First thing to look at is supply. Supply is up 3.8% over this time last year. So that means right now there are more sellers in the market than last year. That would be natural. Last year was a difficult year with all the fluctuation in interest rates and the selling prices needing to balance out those interest rates. So now all of that has equaled out a bit more, and more sellers have come on the market. Contracts signed are up 3.1% over last year, which is also a good sign. That means deals are being made, and that also means that buyers are out there and are ready to go shopping and ready to buy. Liquidity, which is a measure of supply versus demand that gives us numbers, up 0.9% from last year. That's not a lot, but it still shows that there is a rising supply and a rising demand for the market. The market pulse, which is a number that measures the supply and demand and sort of spits out a whole number. If it's above 1, it's a seller's market. If it's below 1, it is a buyer's market. And that number right now is at 0.2. So it means that we're just barely in a buyer's market. I wouldn't consider it a strong buyer's market because you're going to need to get into the negative 10s or negative 11s for that. But at 0.2, we're somewhat in a buyer's market, more so in a neutral market. But the important thing to note is that that number is is higher than it was this time last year. So last year, we were much more firmly in a buyer's market than we are now, which means everything's ticking up. Everything in New York City may be becoming a little bit more normal, and we may be in a seller's market sometime soon. Now let's look at some of the actual pricing that's going on in New York City, because it's been very up and down as of late. Again, it has to settle out against the interest rates, so there's just been some fluctuation with sellers coming on the market thinking they can still get their top price and then realizing, maybe not. But there's still some very interesting numbers to consider here. Price per square foot is up 1.1%. Now, largely that is a measure of condos in New York City. Co-ops, we're selling shares in the company. We're not really selling square footage, but some of that's going to be added in if we know the square footage of a co-op. But it's up 1.1% over last year, which means that overall the prices are increasing in New York City. So if you were looking to get in at the low point in the market, you may have already gone past that point because the price per square foot is going up. The median sales price is up 0.7% year over year. That's not a huge increase. It does match the increase in the price per square foot. And again, even though it's not a huge increase, it is going up. It's trending up. So the prices are going to get a little bit higher probably next sales season. The listing discount in Manhattan right now is negative 3.9%. So what does that mean? That means that the discount between the asking price and the listing price is on an average about 3.9%. Now that heavily depends on what neighborhood you're shopping in, but on an average, negative 3.9%. That's actually less. That discount has decreased year over year. So sellers are getting closer to their asking price than what they were last year. Again, some of these sale prices have had to settle because of the interest rates. So that just means that people are being a little bit more practical about where they're pricing their units for today's market, and that discount as a result is a little lower for the buyer. Now the sales that went for over the asking price are up year over year 1.5%. Again, not a huge increase, but that still tells us that there are very desirable areas in New York City with very desirable units that are getting multiple offers that are driving the prices above the asking price by 1.5% across all the inventory. So if you're shopping in one of the very popular areas of New York City, say the West Village or Greenwich Village or maybe the East Village, Soho, Tribeca, those areas are most likely going to require you to get very close to asking, if not above, with the potential to have a bidding war on really desirable units. Now, right now, if you're looking at some listings on StreetEasy.com or Zillow.com, you may see a lot of price decreases. And that goes back to the seasons. We're entering into a slower season. So those sellers who really want to move their units or maybe need to sell their units because they need to move for a job or whatever reason they may have, those units are being slashed in prices. So going back to the idea of if you can shop during an off season, you may be able to get a little bit of a better bargain. And yet, if you take all of this data into consideration and really look at the trends year over year, you can see that we're still going up on most numbers, which may mean that this time next year, we may be in a seller's market. Maybe not a deep seller's market, not hitting that market pulse of 10s or 11s like we have in other years in the past, but we're trending toward a seller's market. So you need to factor that into waiting to buy. Maybe that really factors into now being the time for you to buy, because now may be your best opportunity to get a bargain. Again, it's highly dependent on what neighborhood you're looking to buy in, what's going on in the market there in that neighborhood, and even more specifically, because we are a vertical market in New York City, we have to look at what's going on in each individual building. Each individual building in New York City has its own set of rules, its own set of requirements, and we look at each building as being its own neighborhood. So If things in that building are going above asking, you can bet that you're going to buy in that building probably above asking if there's a comparable apartment. So you really need to get very micro in how you're looking at the New York City market. But in broad terms, it looks like we're going to trend into a seller's market. We'll see what's going to happen in the fall season, which is the next big season for sales, and see if that holds true. Now, we cannot talk about if you're ready to buy in the New York City market without talking about the interest rates. And so many people that are just coming into the sales market right now are used to seeing the 2.5s and the 3%, and that was just fantastic, but it was not the norm. I have a little bit of gray hair up here, so I can tell you the first interest rate that I got when I made my first purchase, which was many years ago, was 8.5%. And that was the good interest rate. If you had really great credit, great income, 8.5%. So if you look at a 50-year chart, it is very relative in terms of what we're experiencing right now. And in fact, across 50 years, the sixes are pretty normal. Now, of course, we want to try to always get the best interest rates that we can. However, it may be smart to buy low with the interest rate a little higher. And here's why. In New York City, we really do sort of follow the formula that if interest rates are lower, then there's going to be an increase in prices. If interest rates are higher, there's going to be a decrease in prices, because it sort of has to balance out where people are willing to pay their monthly carrying costs, which may include a monthly mortgage, but definitely includes maintenance payments or common charges, and in the case of a condo, property taxes. When you add all that together, there are ranges that people qualify for based on any number of financial qualifications that co-ops or condos require. So the prices and the interest rate sort of have to equal out for buyers to be able to purchase in their range of qualification. So what does all that mean for you? Well, it is smart sometimes to go ahead and take the higher interest rate and buy an apartment at a lower price, because in the future, you cannot ever change what you paid for the apartment, but you can refinance, right? And so that's sort of the secret. Date the interest rate, marry the apartment. That's the old saying that we all sort of abide by. But in a circumstance like this, it is absolutely true. If you can get a lower price on an apartment, but the interest rate isn't quite where you'd like it to be, I would advise go ahead and take it, because you can refinance in the future and change that interest rate if the interest rates come down. Now, one of the big things that you do have to consider if you're buying is, are you ready to buy? And I don't mean mentally. That is something that you'll have to work out with someone else, your partner or your therapist or whomever is going to help you decide whether or not you're mentally and emotionally ready to buy in New York City. But I'm talking about the requirements. About 85% of the inventory in New York City are co-ops, and about 15% are condos. And those buildings have wildly different requirements. And in fact, every co-op building in New York City will have different financial requirements. Many of them want a very low debt to income ratio. So you have to look at your income and your ongoing debt and see where that balances out. Many co-ops want it to be under 30%, maybe even lower in the 25, or I've seen 20 and 15%. So those low debt to income ratios are very important. So you need to consider what your debt to income ratio is and maybe take some steps to lower that debt to income ratio if you can before you would consider purchasing. Do you have funds for your down payment? Because in New York City, it is not the banks that dictate the down payment. It is the individual buildings. Now, across the board, usually for a condo, it's 10% down. For a co-op, however, in general, it's 20% down, but there are many buildings that require 25% down, 30% down, even up to 50% down in some buildings. So are you prepared for that? Do you have the down payment that is required to purchase in New York City? In addition to the funds for down payment, do you have the post close liquidity. So many of the co-ops want to see at least 2 years of mortgage plus maintenance charges in the bank at the time of closing. Now, what you do with that money afterwards is entirely your business, but they want to see that you are liquid. They want to understand if you're going to be a good shareholder coming in the building. So do you have some significant savings or liquid assets to where you could qualify? Now, there are other qualifications, of course, that you would need to meet, credit scores and such things, certainly a pre-approval for your mortgage. But the point is, are you ready financially? And do you have your ducks in a row to be able to qualify for those buildings? Now, don't despair, because not every building has all of these requirements. Some may put an emphasis on debt to income ratio. Some may put an emphasis just on the down payment. You never know. That's part of the value of working with very experienced agents, so that they can help you understand where your qualifications are and then help you go out and find the buildings that you could qualify to purchase in. Now, I promised at the beginning of the video that we were going to talk about what's going on with the rents, and it is a major event in New York City right now, because the FAIR Act, F-A-R-E, the FAIR Act just went into law a number of weeks ago. Overnight, seriously, almost overnight, the rents increased by 15%. And now the data is showing that rentals across the board have increased 22%. Now, rents are always high in New York City and they always increase, but we haven't really ever seen this kind of overnight rental increase. Now, some of you, if you have been renting, may remember that when we recovered from the pandemic, it seemed like rents went up astronomically. However, that was just returning to the normal rents that were already written into leases with discounts applied in the lease. Many renters didn't realize that's what they were signing. They were getting these enormous apartments for very cheap rent, but the lease itself was written at market value with a concession to get you to that cheap rent. So the landlords were really just returning to what all of those leases were written at market value. So this is a bit different because of the FAIR Act and because of how commissions are now being paid by landlords. If you see an advertised apartment, the landlords are beginning to amortize those costs into the monthly rent, which means that the rents have increased 15% to 22% across the board. In addition, a huge amount of rental inventory came off the market. So you as a public consumer can no longer see those listings. You'll have to start calling around to different agents and brokerages and asking if they have anything off market that they can show you. Because if a landlord chooses to keep their unit off market and out of the public eye with no advertising, that includes TikTok, that includes Instagram, no public advertising whatsoever, then they may choose to still be able to pass on that commission to the tenant, which is the old way of doing it. Now, what does all that mean? Basically, that means that rents have increased astronomically almost overnight. Will they stay that way? No one knows. But most likely, if the commissions continue to be paid by the landlords are going to amortize that cost into the rent, which is going to continue to drive up the rentals. So what does that mean for you? Well, if you're thinking about buying, you really need to sit down and crunch some numbers now. Look at the rental market, not just what your rent is, but if you ever need to move, what you may be paying in rent to go somewhere else. And we all know that New Yorkers move around quite a bit if you're renting. So look at the rental market and determine what you're paying right now, and is that going to be comparable to what you could buy for? And then does it make sense that even if you are going to be paying a little bit more to purchase, you're building equity and you're building more in your future? So does that make sense overpaying these higher rent costs? So there you have it. Those are some tips about buying in New York City to help you determine if now is the time for you to buy in New York City. And of course, if you are thinking about buying, there's a lot more information to understand, so I would be happy to help you out. Take a look at the description box below for all the different ways you can get in touch with me. And again, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you can continue to get all this valuable information that we are posting week by week about the New York City real estate market. And I'll see you next time.